Closed captioning of this program is made possible by the Fireman's Fund Foundation.
This week, Governor Schwarzenegger's revised budget calls for deep cuts to California's health and welfare programs. Proposition 15 on the June ballot would test lifting the ban on funding for political candidates. Muni cut services 10%, while a report shows it could save millions in labor costs. And plans to clean up industrial pollution in San Francisco's Hunters Point shipyard. Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on our news panel tonight, Scott Schaefer, host of the California Report on KQED Public Radio on plans for development at the Hunters Point shipyard. Rachel Gordon, staff writer with the San Francisco Chronicle on criticism of Muni. And Josh Richmond, regional legal and political affairs reporter with the Oakland Tribune on Proposition 15. And Malcolm McLaughlin, reporter with Capital Weekly on the May budget revisions. Malcolm, with the state being $20 billion in deficit, I don't suppose there was very much good news coming out of what the governors said to us.
Well, there were maybe a little bit of good news for the higher education, CSU, UC system, state parks. Didn't really get it the way they did last time. They had a lot of supporters that yelled and screamed, but in general, no. I mean, covering the budget process in Sacramento, it's a little bit like when you're a little kid and your mom's trying to teach you how to swim and she keeps backing up and keeps backing up. That, it feels like we're always $20 billion away. And yeah, so I mean, there's huge cuts going on. There was a little bit of good news coming in terms of the tax receipts. The sales tax were coming in a little bit higher, but then we got through sort of the April tax season and income taxes were lower, so we're actually still another 1.3 billion in the hole. And the governor's response is basically what we've seen before. It's deep cuts, mainly to social welfare nets. Health, type programs. I think what was a little bit different this time is the governor kind of went a little bit more with the nuclear option in terms of some of the programs, specifically CalWORKs and Healthy Families that have federal matches, via various formulas, where he would try to cut them, and then people would sue, say, you can't do that, we're going to lose the federal money. Well, he proposes just completely getting rid of the programs, therefore there's nothing to sue over.
I was going to say, this is kind of an opening gambit in a way from the governor, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, there was no talk of new taxes or even extending taxes that are set to, tax increases that are set to expire. There are some corporate tax sort of breaks that are scheduled to take effect. I mean, those things could be gambling, bargaining chips, I suppose.
Well,
but
the governor
certainly
didn't put those on the table from the get-go. And I mean, legislative Republicans made it very clear early on that they weren't going for that stuff. They really have the final say. And the political theater started even earlier this time, where about 100 days before the budget was actually due, Martin Garrick, the new Assembly Republican leader, made a big show of getting out a bunch of calendars and pointing at the wall. But that didn't get them any closer to agreeing because they fundamentally don't agree.
Let me ask you with the political part of this. I mean, it's an election year. Does the governor have anything to lose to just kind of go for it this time? Is there any reason he really needs to compromise and work with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle? Or can he go, this is what I'm going to do, and we're going to keep going forward with it, and I defy you to come up with a better plan?
Well, I mean, I think we got our answer when the governor did the same things that he'd been doing all along, only more so. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're really seeing the real Arnold Schwarzenegger, very libertarian-leaning, not necessarily a big believer in government spending in a lot of ways. So yeah, this is the real guy. I mean, I think when it really kind of raises the question, just watching the budget process though, where we go into next year, where we're going to have like a real Democrat or a real Republican who will have some sort of a constituency in the legislature, because it's really interesting seeing a governor who doesn't really have a constituency there. And often outside of some of these, the May revise, some of the places where the governor really, has sort of a scripted piece in the play, has seemed a little bit irrelevant to the process. I mean, especially now that, he's terming out.
Let's talk about programs that he's planning, or at least has said that he would want to cut, that will have a real relevance in many lives if we're talking about healthy families and other welfare programs.
So the rhetorical creativity that came from some of these social justice, the health groups, just Democrats it was truly breathtaking. And I think they were expecting cuts, but they weren't expecting him to completely, after the fight that we went through with Healthy Families last year, and there was money found to keep it alive, and they cut some kids and not others.
Explain what Healthy Families.
Healthy Families currently provides health care for 900,000 relatively low-income California children who would otherwise be uninsured. I mean, a few years ago under a Democratic administration would have been considered a sacred cow, untouchable. He proposed to get rid of it entirely. A lot of that goes back to the issue I brought up of the fights with the feds and the court battles he kept losing.
One of the things the governor talked about is pension reform, and that's something that local governments are also very concerned about. Certainly San Francisco is, where they're just unable to keep up with the match for these public employee unions, and it seems like it's setting up this conflict between two Democratic constituencies. You've got folks who are concerned about education and health care and social welfare programs, and then you got the unions who are really trying to protect those things. So I'm wondering if there's some kind of a confrontation coming within among the Democrats over how to solve this thing.
Well, it's been happening behind the scenes for a long time. I mean, I think as long as Democrats are facing the situation there in Sacramento, they're not going to let that kind of get out in quite the same way. But I mean, these issues have been going on for a long time, and there's actually a lot of discontent with the public employee unions among other Democrats. And I think the public employee unions in the long run are going to have to give some ground there. But Arnold Schwarzenegger or Meg Whitman, probably not the people who are going to make that happen. Sort of a Nixon goes to China kind of moment. I think Jerry Brown might be more able to take that on.
You talked about another program in addition to the one affecting children that the governor has talked about just getting rid of. Explain
This all just came out today, and we're just still all digging through the details. But it essentially seems that he's getting rid of welfare in California as we know it. So yeah, I mean, it's really, really major cuts.
So a big thing is, will the local jurisdictions, will counties who have the welfare programs, will they step in? I mean, they're all hurting financially as well, but are they going to let the poorest of the poor go without housing, go without food, go without clothing? The onus is going to be on them, I would guess.
Well, that's what happens is these battles then spin out to the counties. And so, I mean, we have a really interesting case going on in Sacramento right now around mental health. Where you have basically the counties have gotten walloped by the state cuts, the blue pencil, and are basically trying to get rid of the nonprofits that have been doing a lot of the work, taking care of people with substance abuse and mental health. The people who would basically be on the streets, going into the emergency rooms, taking up police time, taking up revenue that way. Sacramento County, all the other counties, they're trying to figure that out right now. So, I mean, this is really just the start of the battle, but basically he's signaled his intention. He's going to throw this one down to the counties too.
In spite of the bad times.
And figure it out.
In spite of the bad times, there are many people who really would like to run for office, would like to be in the position of trying to govern the state in its bad position. So we turn to Josh Richmond, who's going to talk about a proposition that would change the way we fund the election of some of the people who
Indeed
want
it would,
to
except not those people yet. What Prop 15 called the California Fair Elections Act would do is it would lift the ban on public funding for campaigns and start a pilot project in which we try a system of public funding only for the Secretary of State's election in 2014 and 2018. And basically the way this would work is that a candidate would have to raise small donations, $5 donations from about 7,500 registered voters. And if they could show that level of public support, they'd then be eligible to get this public funding. They'd have to, if they get it, they'd have to swear not to take any other private funding for the duration of the campaign. And it would basically work out that they get a base amount of funding, and then whatever they need to match what's being spent by people who didn't accept the public funding, up to a limit of about $5 million in the primary, a limit of about $6.5 million in the general election. Now, the Secretary of State's office is, I saw one person describe it as sort of an electoral backwater. People don't spend a lot of money on the Secretary of State's office because not that many people run for Secretary of State because not many people know what the Secretary of State even does. The Secretary of State, for the record, is the chief elections officer of the state, administers our electoral systems, our campaign finance system, has some custodial duties in terms of registration of businesses and the like. But it's not a glamorous office, so a lot of money doesn't typically get spent on this.
But isn't that a reason for wanting to make that the first office that you do, since they have so much power over elections?
They have power
so
over elections.
Who's the Secretary of State?
The Secretary of State right now, the incumbent running for re-election this
Hillary
year
Clinton,
is well, that's a whole different Secretary of State. The California Secretary of State is Deborah Bowen, a Democrat. She's running for re-election this year. There are a couple of Republicans vying for the nomination to challenge her, but this won't take effect this year. This is again a pilot project for 2014.
Josh, let me just jump in for a second. I mean, in politics, dancing, timing's everything, right?
Right.
And we're just talking about how bad the budget is. We already know that people don't really like the politicians right now. Is this a time to go forward and say, let's spend money on politicians? I mean, maybe it is, but is this something that's been cooking for a while and they just kind of got it together to go on the ballot, or do they think this is a good time to do it?
I think it's in some ways it's a bad time, but in some ways it's kind of a good time too, because think of the disgust that I think a lot of voters seem to be having over the way that money is dictating politics right now, whether it's special interest money on both sides of the aisle, or whether it's self-funders. I'm not going to name any names. I think you know who we're talking about. But that raises an interesting question because, you know, the big self-funders this year, I guess I will name some names, are in the governor's race, you know, which is orders of magnitude more money than ever gets spent in a race like this. So it raises the question, even if you get this working for the Secretary of State's office, if this is incremental change, how would you possibly pay for something like a governor's race? This is being paid for through an increase in the fees that lobbyists pay to register. Not a lot of sympathy out there for lobbyists, generally speaking. But if you're taking this out of the general fund, I don't think people are going to be all that happy about it.
I mean, as you said, these races tend to be relatively low profile. They're relatively cheap. And so it doesn't really cost a lot of money. So that's a benefit. At least it's a kind of a selling point for this.
Right.
But on the other hand, what's the real incentive for a candidate to use public funds? Because it seems like kind of 7,500 donations of $5 each. That's a lot of organizing, a lot of time. I mean, wouldn't it be just as easy to have a fundraiser and raise, $100, $250 a pop?
Well, that remains to be seen. You know, I think there are those who think that with the advent of online fundraising, it would be a lot easier these days to raise $5 a pop from that many people, than it used to be when you had to actually go out and get it or get people to mail it to you. So.
One more complication.
Yes.
This would sort of go at crossbars with Prop 14, right?
Well, not exactly. You know, it's hard to see. There would be some intersection, obviously, Prop 14 being the top two primary measure that's on the same ballot. It would complicate things somewhat, although this does make provisions for both primary and general, and I think that could probably be reconciled. That may be the least of our worries.
Because Prop 14 calls for an open primary, and this says the primary parties.
Right. There are provisions made for third parties and independents in this as well.
Right. Well, in case we've confused you a bit, a quick program note: we will be covering each of the state propositions every week leading up to the June 8th election, and the first half of our 1-hour broadcast on May 28th will be dedicated to the election. Well, there are money problems all over, both at the state level as well as at city level. But Rachel, you're here to talk about money problems in transit. Some transit district, at least BART's doing okay, but not Muni. So what in particular has caused Muni's problems?
Well, as you said, it's money. So why are there money problems at Muni? This is something that Muni struggled with for years, and there are a number of reasons. The big one is the state. There's been a huge state hit in taking away transit assistance funding, about $300 million over the last few years. They're saying if the state didn't take our money, raid the money that the voters said should go to transit projects, we'd be fine, we'd be flush, we wouldn't have to worry about this. People say there might be deeper reasons with Muni. A big component seems to be labor, that management's hands are tied by city voters for more than 40 years, saying when you go to the bargaining table to forge a new contract, you can talk about everything, but you can't talk about salary. That's going to be set by a formula that makes them automatically the second highest paid transit operators in the country. So why is that a big deal? Okay, they have a hard job, maybe they should get paid a lot of money, but if you can't negotiate salary, you can't negotiate a lot of other things. And there are some work rules we're finding out. There was just a new audit out by the Board of Supervisors budget analysts that said there are things like overtime rules that get in the way. It costs a lot of money that really favor operators. You don't have to work a full 40-hour week before you can collect overtime, get an overtime shift. Things like part-time drivers, that would really help when you have a morning rush hour and an evening rush hour. But there's a de facto prohibition on part-time drivers in San Francisco because of the work rules. So San Francisco's paying a lot of overtime that way, where a lot of other transit agencies have them. So that's one of the big reasons that's driving the whole problem with Muni. There's a lot of talk for reform. Whether that happens remains to be seen.
Well, and it's interesting because the supervisors are, of course, very pro-transit. They want people out of their cars. They want people they're threatening the MTA with their budget cuts and so on. And yet, Sean Ellsburn, the supervisor who's circulating one of these ballot measures to change the work rules and change the way salaries are set to put it on the bargaining table, there isn't a single vote at the Board of Supervisors in support of that. I mean, he's getting no support whatsoever.
Right.
So what's going on there? They say they're for Muni, they want to improve service, and yet here's something that would...
A couple of issues. I mean, it's a very union-friendly town. We can't forget about that. And I think the people who are against Ellsburn's measure says, look, don't just target this one group of employees. Let's look at bigger things. How come there's a minimum staffing level in the police department? How come firefighters in San Francisco have shorter work weeks than other firefighters have on the whole? Saying, let's do real employee reform. Let's not just go after Muni operators. I think, though, that if Ellsburn's proposed initiative qualifies for the ballot, he has till early July to see if he could collect enough signatures, then you might see more politicians jumping on the bandwagon. Also, next week we're going to have the deadline for proposed charter amendments coming from the Board of Supervisors. There's going to be 1, 2, maybe 3, probably a couple of measures that are going to be targeting Muni as well. But we have to go to the good news too, Belva, not just with Muni, but you said BART has good news. So BART found out that it's been plagued with having to cut service and raise fares and things. They have a $4 or $5 extra million now, so they got to debate at their board this week, how can we spend the extra money? Do we give it back to the riders and lower fares? Do we increase service? Do we clean the cars? Some people are saying something, this is crazy for a politician to say, maybe we should sock it away in case times get bad again in the budget. So we're seeing a little bit of good news,
aren't
bad
those
news.
two kind of the bookends of like a really well-run system that you always hear about and a really not so well-run system?
I mean, we have to also look, though, well-run or not well-run. I mean, Muni is by far the largest transit system in the Bay Area, close to 700,000 boardings a day. It's about double what BART has, which is the next largest. San Francisco, BART is a train system, right? They have trains.
Right.
San Francisco has buses, historic streetcars, cable cars, trains, electric buses, diesel buses. In a dense city, there are a lot of complications
I know
there.
a lot of people who've said, well, I'll walk 7 extra blocks if I get to take BART instead of Muni.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And one thing we have to talk about reliability, the
Yeah.
10% service cuts, those come on top of other service reductions where lines were eliminated last fall. People are paying more money for less service, waiting longer for service, and more crowded buses.
Well, Muni's also paying out a lot of money for accidents and litigation, that kind of thing. I mean, how big a portion of, how big a part of the problem is that?
And I think over the last 5 years or 6 years, it's averaged $10 or $11 million a year in paying out fees. One thing, though, we have to also look at is where else the money comes from. It's not just the state, it's not just the fare box, which is only around 20% comes there, but it's also from the city's general fund and a lot from parking. So there are a lot of supervisors who are pro-transit supervisors who are saying, let's raise parking fines, let's raise parking fees, let's expand parking meter hours in San Francisco. But a lot of them are saying that's a great idea, but not in my district, because a lot of people pay parking tickets and they're not happy with it.
And there have been significant raises on those already recently. I mean, I think I got a $78 burrito a few weeks ago, but by
Yes,
getting
and
a
I walked
ticket
outside to a
Yeah.
$55 parking ticket this morning. But that is one issue that they're looking at. There's also talk for going on the November ballot with a revenue measure. Can you raise some kind of tax, a sales tax, a hotel tax, something to funnel Muni? As you said, it's a transit-first city in San Francisco. I mean, it's discouraged the use of the automobile, but there are a lot of things to balance it with. Can you force people on the bus system if it's really not working reliably?
So where are we now? Are there cuts are the cuts in place, or when do they?
Yes, the cuts went into effect on May 8th, so that's a 10% service reduction. The Board of Supervisors, as Scott mentioned, is threatening to hold up Muni's budget unless those cuts are rolled back at least in half or around half. Muni folks are trying to figure out whether they can do that. They're already promising that about a year and a half from now, they'll roll those back. But that's where it is. It's really now, as we talked about fights in the legislature and with the governor, that's a fight we're going to see at City Hall right now between the Board of Supervisors and the mayor.
Okay, so we can move finally from money to the environment. Scott, your story's about Hunters Point Naval Shipyard that is polluted. Why, how did it become polluted, and what's being done, and are they cleaning it up?
Well, you wouldn't know it today, Belva, out at the shipyard. If you walk around, it's a very desolate place. But back in the 40s and 50s, it was a huge industrial site. It was the shipyard where a lot of work was being done to help gear up for World War II. There were ships being repaired, maintained, painted, submarines and submarine parts, periscopes being manufactured, and so on. And so in the course of all that, remember, this is well before the environmental movement. There were all kinds of chemicals, oils, diesel, solvents, PCBs were dumped out there without any kind of regulations. Some of it sank into the ground and polluted the soil. Some of it's in the groundwater. And so when the base was decommissioned back some 37 years ago, the Navy began to, as they talked about developing it, began to clean it up. And so for the past 20 years, the Navy has spent about $700 million cleaning up the soil and the groundwater, beginning to turn it over to the city so that it can be built for, built housing can be built there. The Alice Griffiths public housing project is going to be redone and so on, but it hasn't quite cleared all the hurdles yet. And in San Francisco, there's always a lot of hurdles to clear. There's a lot of concern in the neighborhood that the cleanup hasn't been as complete as it should be. Some suspicion lingering. There's a legacy of mistrust in the Bayview over things like power plants and sewage plants being dumped there. So there are a lot of concerns, but next month, there's going to be a joint hearing of the Redevelopment and Planning Commissions to kind of move this thing to the next phase so that construction can begin once those approvals come.
So this actually is a story about money too, right? Because there's some very big commercial development, commercial and residential development on the table here.
Yeah, this is what's called a brownfield, you know, land that really can't be developed until the toxics, the pollutants are cleaned up. But once it's cleaned up, it has enormous potential. I mean, it's prime property. It's on the waterfront. I was down there this week looking out, getting a tour. I mean, you can see downtown, the bay. It's very nice. And if the city could begin to develop that with housing, commercial space, even open space to bring people out there to shop and so on, it would generate huge amounts of revenue.
You mentioned brownfield, but this property, I think, has also been designated as a Superfund site.
It is. It's a Superfund site, which is one kind of brownfield. And it indicates a level of priority for the EPA to clean this up. And it's a good thing that it is, because it means the infusion of hundreds of millions of dollars. I mentioned they've spent about $700 million. There's another $400 to $500 million that's going to be needed to be spent before it's all the land that they want to develop is available
so, Scott,
and clean.
Is the Navy fighting this, the extra money that's needed? Is that where the fight is, with the city saying you have to do X, Y, or Z, and the Navy saying we've done enough? Or is the Navy committed at this point, the federal government, to say whatever it takes to get this land clean, we're going to do it? Well,
you know, it's not just the city. There's regional, there's air quality, there's the California EPA, there's the toxic substances. So there's several layers, starting with the U.S. environmental, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. So it is the Navy cleaning it up. They're not really, they're following the rules. There's tremendous oversight and different levels of redundancy in terms of testing of the soil and the air and so on. So I wouldn't say they're fighting it. I mean, especially with Nancy Pelosi and President Obama pretty committed to getting this done. I think they see this as a kind of model for a base conversion.
And how do the people who are living there feel both about the cleanup and about this proposed development?
You know, we were out there this week. There, as I said, a legacy of suspicion and mistrust.
Well, also, I mean, the feeling that cleanups in the Bay Area are often an excuse to move the people out who are already there.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of work to be done, but they want it done. They want it done soon, and they're hoping that it will be.
Well, you can hear much more about cleaning up California's brownfields, including the Hunters Point Shipyard, on the May edition of Health Dialogues, and that'll be hosted by Scott Schaefer of KQED Public Radio. That's next Thursday night at 8 o'clock. Well, my thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Now, some other stories from the news this week. The city of Richmond and the Chevron oil refinery reached an agreement that prevents a bitter battle at the ballot box. Chevron will make additional tax payments to the city, totaling some $114 million over 15 years. The deal ends the long dispute between the city and Chevron over how much tax the refinery should pay, which would have gone before voters in competing initiatives in November. Responding to the disastrous oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, Senators Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer and 4 other West Coast senators have introduced legislation to permanently ban offshore drilling in federal waters along the coast. Governor Schwarzenegger last week withdrew his support of drilling off the Santa Barbara coast. May 13th was the 50th anniversary of what has come to be known as Black Friday. Police used high-pressure hoses on demonstrators against the House Un-American Activities Committee hearing at San Francisco City Hall. This week, some of the participants gathered there again to commemorate the historic incident. Well, that's all for tonight. Visit kqed.org/thisweek to watch complete episodes and segments from our program. You can subscribe to our newsletter and our podcast and share your thoughts about our stories. We close with images of the 3 heads, 6 arms sculpture installed this week in the Civic Center to mark the 30th anniversary of San Francisco's sister city relationship with Shanghai. I'm Belva Davis. Good night.